Hello, everyone. My name is Jana Weiss. I'm the Student Life Coordinator at Coleman College. Today, we're going to be talking about your rights, your voting rights in U.S. Constitution and what all this means. We have a wonderful guest with us today, Dr. Annie Johnson Benefield, and she is going to be with us in just a moment. Please remember that if you have any questions, please type them in the chat and we will get to them as soon as we can. Thank you, and please welcome Dr. Annie Johnson Benefield.
Good afternoon. It's actually official afternoon. I am so excited to be here today. In light of the fact that I did something really tremendous this morning, the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services swore in 1,958 new citizens from 113 countries. So I came from that back here. And I thought this would be a great way to talk about your responsibilities and rights as a citizen in terms of voting rights in the United States Constitution. So those 1,958 people will become new citizens, and we registered them to vote today. And in the past, our expectation level, we've been able to register at least 80 to 90% of the people who are sworn in as a new citizen at these particular events. Probably the most amazing thing about the United States Constitution, some of the things are happy things and some of them are not so happy in terms of the mentioning of individuals and individual rights. But voting rights and the US Constitution, there's nothing in the original United States Constitution that mentioned an entitlement or a right for citizens to vote and participate in the political process. There, it talks about the time and manner and place of election. It says that federal elections have to be held the first Tuesday after the first Monday. So a Monday has to occur before the election in November happens. But it pretty much delegates the responsibility in terms of voting rights to states, in terms of setting the standards or not. So the U.S. Constitution initially did not say anything about voting, the right to vote. They left that power almost exclusively up to the state. And so states set eligibility requirements. And so I want to talk about that. And I want to kind of go through some things to show some of what has happened in this process. Voting, a fundamental right in the democratic process that one must have, at least I think that's required in terms of participating and to be a full citizen. And in order to have a legitimate form of government as a republic, citizens are asked to participate in that particular process. Before I go further in terms of talking about voting in elections, I need to tell you these are some important dates that you need to chronicle on your calendar. For the general election that's coming up in November, it's referred to as the November midterm election. You will have an array of different candidates on the ballot, from the governor, U.S. House members, state legislators, commissioners, judges, and a whole series of people. So the general election, the last day to register to vote is October 11th. The first day to vote early in person is October 24th. That's when early voting starts. October 28th is the last day to apply for a vote by mail ballot. So if you are, and the requirements for that is if you're disabled, if you're scheduled to have a baby within 3 weeks of the election, or if you're going to be out of town during the entire early voting time period, if you're 65 years older, then you can actually ask for a ballot to vote by mail. Those are the only conditions in the state of Texas that you could actually do that. And then election day, and your vote by mail ballot has to be received by November 8th, which is the official election day. So bear that in mind. So when we talk about voting, and this is what voting is, it's an active choice that individuals perform when they formally choose among alternative candidates, parties, and depending on the election, alternative policies. And in a republic form of government, citizens are asked to weigh in and state their preference for policies, candidates, and or political parties. That's what voting is. And it's perceived as a fundamental right in the election process. In a democratic society, the expectations is the citizen will have a voice, and voting is the most common form of political participation that exists in our society. Writing letters to elected officials are now, in lieu of writing letters, emails, or following politicians online and a whole series of other things, or sending a TikTok message to them, or Instagram, or other ways in terms of communication exists. But voting is an act that you have to be engaged in terms of performance. 50 years ago, the Voting Rights Act, more than 50 years ago, happened. In our society, there have been barriers to suffrage. And when you talk about suffrage, it's equivalent to the idea of voting. You've had age, that a person could not vote unless they were a certain age. 21 years old was considered the standard. You had gender, that only males could actually vote and participate in the political process. Property. Up until the 1820s, you had to own properties. Here in the state of Texas, in order to vote in school board elections, it wasn't until 1970s that particular requirement was eliminated. So if you lived in an apartment, you can vote in school board election because you were not a property owner. Therefore, you weren't eligible to vote in that political process. Residency. Some states made it increasingly very difficult for people to vote by establishing extended residency time periods, saying that you had to live there a year or more or whatever in order to cast a ballot to vote in elections in their respective state. Mental compasses. In the Texas Constitution, there was something that said lunatics and idiots were not allowed to vote. And so if you've been declared mentally incompetent by a court, you have to go back to court to get that actually eliminated. And the idea of idiots, meaning that if your IQ was below a certain level, and the state constitution did not specify what exactly that is. Literacy. In many states across the country, there was a literacy requirement. The assumption if you had a sixth grade education, you were considered literate, but some states actually had tests, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama. Texas did not have a literacy test, but some other states had literacy tests, and you would have to pass this test in order to register to vote. Moral of good character test, that you had to be a good moral character. Some states had laws that if you lewdly and lasciviously cohabitated, then you couldn't vote. Or if you were a child of someone that had children that were born out of wedlock, then you could vote, that you had to prove your good character. And frequently, blackness of skin was considered you did not have a good character. And the poll tax. Texas did, in fact, have a poll tax. It was $1.50, and then it went up to $1.75. And that existed up until the 1960s when the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. And now you don't think of $1.50 or $1.75 as being equivalent to much, but actually you could buy quite a bit of groceries with that amount of money in those days. You could buy groceries to feed your family, and you had to pay the poll tax at the beginning of the year leading up to the election. And many people opted not to pay the poll tax in order so they could actually feed their family, as opposed to using a day's wage to actually vote and participate in the political process. Felons, people who were in prison. In the state of Texas, if you have been tried, convicted, and you've served your time and you're no longer, as the word say, on paper, you can actually cast a ballot. You've served out your probation, you've served out your parole, you can actually cast a ballot as long as you're no longer on paper. Some states permanently disenfranchise people after they've had a felony conviction or a felony conviction for a particular type of crime. Registration. Oftentimes, registration was required way in advance of an election, that you had to register so far in advance. Right now, the registration requirements, as long as you register 30 days, October 11th is the cutoff date for the election on November 8th. That as long as you register by October 11th, you can vote and participate in the election for November 8th. And race, that the idea that if you belong to a particular racial group and you cannot participate or vote in the political process. So this is why we think the paradox of voting is a civic duty, maintaining popular control of elections, that means citizens having an input, is the very essence of democracy. So this is why we believe voting is important. And elections provide the medium by which we have the peaceful transfer of power, that from one election cycle to the next election cycle. And we've only had a few instances when the person totally refused to leave office. Here in the state of Texas in the 1800s during Reconstruction, someone chose not to do that. But eventually the state militia was called out and that person actually left office as a governor. So these are the qualifications to vote: 18 years of age, U.S. citizen, a resident of Texas for 30 days, a resident of the county for 30 days in which you live in, cannot be a current felon, meaning that you cannot be still on paper serving probation or parole, and you must be mentally competent. These are the requirements to actually engage and vote and participate in the political process in Texas. So these were the states that allowed individuals to vote prior to the 26th Amendment. You had to be 21 years old in almost all of the states. Georgia and Kentucky allowed people to vote at 18, Alaska 19, and Hawaii 20. So young voters. Women in suffrage. 1869, Wyoming was the first territory to allow women to vote and participate in the political process in the United States. 16 states prior to the ratification of the 19th Amendment allowed women the right to vote. Remember, I said the US Constitution originally did not specify. It was left up to the states. And so states had varied requirements for who they would allow to vote, who they allowed to participate in the political process. Primarily, it was white males who were property owners or tax-paying. So these are some of the women in suffrage states, the states that actually allowed for women. It was pretty much the Western territories more so than on the East Coast. It seemed like the most barriers existed on the East Coast. Texas in 1918 allowed women to vote in the primary for the first time. And then when the 19th Amendment was ratified subsequently. So voting was a privilege for those who had enough money or enough land to be politically responsible. And so states restricted voting to those who owned property. And these are some of the limited voting to taxpayers in the state and in national election. Benjamin Franklin said this in his Wit and Wisdom thing: today a man owns the jackass worth $50 and he's entitled to vote. But before the next election, the jackass dies. And guess what? The man can't vote, because he no longer owns property. And I know this is not the typical jackass. This is the Shrek in the movie Shrek jackass. That I thought was an appropriate analogy to express what Benjamin Franklin meant in that sense. So in the 1820s, when Andrew Jackson ran for president, the property requirements in most states was pretty much dropped, requiring people to be tax-paying qualifications or actually owning a certain amount of property. And the amount of property that people own varied from state to state. And an interesting analogy that I was reading, that North Carolina required that you had to have debt-free property, meaning you couldn't have any liens on it. And if their property requirement was such that the property value would be worth at least close to $1 million today in order to vote or to actually to hold office, not only was there a qualification for voting, but for holding office. So state residency requirements. Some states, this is a map, and this tells you the amount of time that different states allow for state residency requirements now in terms of voting. And you can see some states 1 to 19 days. And then some states have no residency requirements. Once you move there, you're considered a resident and you can subsequent vote. Texas required a 1-year residence in the state before you could actually register to vote. Mental competence, the whole idea of lunatics and idiots could not vote. By state law. Voting rights, literacy. So you had to take a literacy test in some states, not here in Texas, but in other states. Here's an interesting video clip. I hope it plays out. Please let it work. Just never know if it's going to work. Let me know if it worked.
What Mr. Dunn down at the rest home, isn't that right? Yes. And what old Dunn say, on one of his gals down here starting a fuss. Oh, starting a fuss, and just here trying to register to vote. Beside the Constitution preamble. You know what the preamble is? We the people of the United States. In order to perform how many county judges in Alabama? 67.
So in some communities, and you're looking at that was out of the movie Selma, talking about voting rights and the literacy test in the state of Alabama. Oftentimes you could be asked a question as inane as how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap, or how much sand is there on a beach? Any number of questions could be asked. My father-in-law talks about the idea that he was asked to name all of the statewide elected officials when he went to actually take his literacy test. And he missed the Secretary of Agriculture, and they said, when you know more information, then you can come back and offer to register to vote. So the moral good character test, I said, vouch for one's moral character. Oftentimes you had to have someone to actually vouch for your moral character. Or if you were cohabitating, or if you were a parent of illegitimate children, then therefore you could not cast a vote. In Idaho, it had a law that said bigamists could not actually cast a ballot and vote. And the poll tax here in Texas, as I said, it was $1.50 to $1.75 that you would have to pay in advance of the election in order to be able to vote. In Alabama, it was $2. In some instances, they were asked, 11 southern states had the poll tax. Alabama not only had a literacy test, but it also had a poll tax. And sometimes you were asked to pay for the back taxes for every year that you were eligible to vote. Prior to that, then you needed to pay the amount equivalent because you hadn't been able to vote. This is the state of Louisiana poll tax receipt, just showing you in terms of historical reference point. This is young college students registering people on campus to vote and participate. Some states have same day or no registration at all. You show up at the polling location, you can actually cast your vote that day. Minnesota, some years ago, way before many of your time, depending on how old you are as a student, Jesse the Ventura, the wrestler, actually won the election because more young people knew about him and turned out and voted in Minnesota, and he became the governor of Minnesota as a direct result of that. It wasn't that people so much knew about his policy, but they knew him as a wrestler. So registration blocks, you must register to vote in advance in all but 8 states in the United States. So that becomes important, that October 11 is that deadline date that you have to register to vote. And this is showing some of the states with same day voter registration that you could show up, cast your ballot, and go. So this is talking about the Texas case in terms of Texas registration requirement. This early registration requirement primarily targeted migrant workers until it was voided in 1970s. Felons, disenfranchisement. If you've been tried and convicted of a crime in some states, you permanently lose your voting rights. This is 5.3 million citizens have lost their rights to vote because of a felony conviction. More recently, in contemporary time, the state of Florida, people placed on the ballot an initiative to actually allow for people to vote after they had served their time. They were no longer on probation or parole because they had a commission that you could apply to, but so few people were getting their rights restored. After the initiative was placed on the ballot, it passed overwhelmingly. Then people thought they were able to actually go vote. And then something else happened. The state passed the law that said you had to pay all restitution, all fees or fines that had been due prior to that time. So if you couldn't pay them, you still could not vote. And the Supreme Court actually upheld that in a case a couple of years ago. And so during the last election, in 2020 election cycle, people were actually trying to raise money for people to do that. Some of the people actually thought because they were registered to vote, they went out and registered after having served their time in the felony conviction. And so more recently, the Election Integrity Unit has been going out arresting people who actually registered, who actually voted in the previous election. They didn't know that they weren't eligible to vote. So state felony laws and policy. This shows you states where they have policies in terms of permanent disenfranchisement of individuals, their laws and particular policies. A third of African-American men lost their right to vote in the following states: Virginia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Kentucky, as a result of having had a felony conviction. So this becomes pretty important in that sense. So when we talk about voting rights in the Constitution, the elimination of barriers to suffrage. And one of those things that has been pronounced in that particular process is the constitutional amendments. And so when you talk about constitutional amendments, and I need to say this because this is so important to me, whereas people think of voting rights as a political or partisan issue, but voting rights in a democratic society are fundamental to participating in the political process and should not be encumbered based on one's political party or persuasion. That is irrelevant, that citizen participation is critical for a republic form of government to exist, because casting a ballot is giving consent to the people that you're electing to represent you. Casting a ballot on an initiative is stating a position on a particular policy issue. So when you look at the US Constitution in its entirety, there have only been 27 amendments to the entire Constitution. The first 10 of them actually took place, the Bill of Rights in 1791. The other 17 amendments was subsequently followed it. There's one amendment, which is not germane to voting rights, but I think I need to tell you this, that actually regulated social behavior, prohibition. The amendment was put, the 18th Amendment, and then it was subsequently repealed by the 21st Amendment. So we actually have 26 amendments that officially exist in the space in terms of talking about the Constitution. And if you look at the entirety of the 27 amendments, there have been at least 6 amendments added to the Constitution since the Bill of Rights, which is a third of the amendments, nearly a third of the amendments added that expanded voting rights. This is important, that I want you to remember this and go out and tell your friends that as the Constitution has been changed and added to, that the expansion of voting rights has been very pronounced in the United States Constitution. Meaning pronounced, that amendments have been added to the Constitution that expanded voting rights, not rescinded or restricted them. The 15th Amendment, it is referred to as part of the Civil War amendments that took place. The 13th Amendment in terms of the freeing of the slaves, the 14th Amendment guaranteeing equal protection and due process, and the 15th Amendment said that the state of the government could not restrict a person's right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so that was the 15th Amendment, was added to the Constitution in 1870. The 17th Amendment, and many people don't think very much of this amendment as being part of the expansion of voting rights, but this amendment is actually very interesting in that for the first time after the ratification of the 17th Amendment, individuals in their respective states were allowed to vote for their US senator. In the original United States Constitution, it allowed for the state legislature to select United States senators, and each state gets 2 United States senators, and the state legislature had the job of selecting who those senators were. Let that sink in for a minute, because I think this is critical, and this is very important, that the 17th Amendment allowed for the direct election of senators by the population in terms of citizens in their respective states. So that's considered a major change to the Constitution. The 19th Amendment, just less than a month ago, actually less than 3 weeks ago, on August 26th, we celebrated something called the League of Women Voters celebrated Women Equality Day, which was the certification of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which allowed for women to actually vote and participate in the political process across the entire country. And some might argue, which is truthfully so, that women of color had a much more difficult time in terms of overcoming this hurdle. For the most part, white women were advantaged, Hispanic women were not, and Asian women, in part because of the Chinese Exclusion Act that many Asian women they couldn't participate in the political process, even though the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. Until the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1940s, they were not allowed to participate. So the 19th Amendment, and I know people say it granted women suffrage. Actually, women fought long, hard, an arduous battle in terms of trying to get the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution in order to get the right to vote. The 23rd Amendment, little unknown, most people don't think about it, think nothing of it. DC, which is the heart of the United States Capitol, is 10 square miles. It is the seat of democracy, as we call it, is the heart of what the major institutions of government exist. But people lived in the District of Columbia. And because they didn't live in, DC is not a state, it's the District of Columbia, they could not cast a ballot for president of the United States because the District of Columbia was not a state, it did not have electoral college votes. And so basically all of those people who lived, at one point they said at least 1 million people lived in the District of Columbia. Now I think it's about 600 and some thousand, not quite 700,000, which the population is actually larger than that in Wyoming and larger than the population in Vermont, yet these individuals could not cast a ballot to vote in a presidential contest. The 23rd Amendment added to the Constitution in 1961 gave the District of Columbia 3 electoral college votes, which made the number 538 versus 535, because only states were granted electoral college vote based on the number of representatives and senators. And so as a result of this, DC has non-voting representatives in the US House of Representatives, but it still does not have a senator because it is not a state. And therefore, that is not part of the process. The 24th Amendment, added to the Constitution in 1964, eliminated the poll tax in federal election. And so this expanded the electorate. Remember the poll tax, $1.50 to $1.75? This actually disenfranchised poor Blacks and poor whites because this was a day's wage. And how many people, if you were poor, would use a day's wage, simply pay that so you could vote and participate in the political process? So it was an impediment or barrier that precluded people from voting and participating in the political process. The 26th Amendment came to be added to the United States Constitution directly in response to the Vietnam War, that 18-year-olds could actually be drafted, go off to war and fight. But yet at the same time, they didn't have a say or in the political process, except for in the state that I showed you before, that 18-year-olds could actually vote. So Kentucky and Georgia was only 2 states. So they could be drafted, go off to war and fight in a war, but yet they had no say in terms of their political leaders were, or to have a say in terms of public policy issue. So the 26th Amendment in 1971 was added to the Constitution, which lowered the voting age to 26 years old. And this was actually came about in terms of the Constitution, added to the Constitution during Richard Nixon's presidency. So that's the amazing thing about the United States Constitution, that more amendments have been added to the United States Constitution that facilitated the expansion of voting rights than any other section of the Constitution, than to correct for structural changes or variations or some differentials. So there are many more things that I could possibly say about voting rights in America and the United States. We've had Supreme Court decisions that have actually expanded and or eliminated voting rights. These are some of Minor versus Happersett is a case that dealt with Virginia Minor. She was a woman and she was suing, trying to get the right to vote. Reese versus the United States was a Supreme Court case that under the 15th Amendment, Blacks have the right to vote. Someone sued, the Supreme Court said that the 15th Amendment didn't confer anybody the right to vote on anybody. It just simply said you can deny a person the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but it did not explicitly confer the right to vote on anyone. Other amendments, Gwynn versus the United States, the grandfather clause. This provision said if your grandfather had voted prior to the Civil War, then you could vote. So the Supreme Court ruled, the Gwynn versus the United States, that said the grandfather clause was unconstitutional. Smith versus All Right, right here in Texas, the Democratic Party had an all-white primary, that the Democratic Party was considered a private organization and institution, although if you got elected as a Democratic Party person, you were actually elected to office without any fanfare for the general election because of the solid Democratic South after the Civil War. So the Supreme Court ruled that the all-white primary was unconstitutional. Harper versus the Virginia State Board of Election. In this particular amendment, the Supreme Court ruled that the poll tax was unconstitutional, and therefore states could not use this any longer to disenfranchise. And South Carolina versus Katzenbach dealt with the Voting Rights Act that was passed in 1965, which was an attempt to include minority groups, particularly people of color, in terms of African Americans, in terms of getting them franchised to vote. And this is US versus Texas, striking down the poll tax in elections in Texas. The Voting Rights Act, we'll talk about that another day. Some of the provisions is pretty exciting. Talking about it still exists, although some sections have been declared null and void by the Supreme Court in decisions that it's rendered. The last time the Voting Rights Act was expanded was called the Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosie Park, Coretta Scott King Voting Rights Reauthorization Act in 2006 when George W. Bush was president, and it was expanded, the Voting Rights Act, for another 25 years. And that is the signing of that particular document. So there are lots of other cases that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act raised serious constitutional questions. Sorry. That is what the Supreme Court said. And then several years later, in 2013, the Supreme Court said Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional because the formula that had been used as a pre-clearance could no longer be utilized. And so in response to that, quite a few states start passing voter ID legislation and superimposing some other restrictions in terms of voting. These are states that have voter identification laws. The green here shows states that has really strict voter ID. This is a strict non-photo ID kind of state. And this, the photo ID are requested in these states that are like North Dakota, Wyoming, and Ohio. ID requested, photo not required in states that have the light green. And these are the states where no ID is required at all. You show up at the polling location with a gray, and you can simply cast a ballot. So Texas fall under the photo ID required, that the state will actually issue you a photo ID, but you actually have to pay for, the supporting documentation you need in order to get, such as a birth certificate, a marriage license, or any other documentation that you might need in order to support, to prove that you are who you say you are in that process. And usually if I was doing this presentation in person, guess what I would do? I would actually allow you to take the literacy test and see how many people got it right, how many got the person who got the most questions correct. And then I would give you a $5 Starbucks card to actually have to go get a mocha latte or something like that in response to that. The greatest gift is not being afraid to question. That's what Ruby Dee said. So this is the part, I think we're at that point where we can actually officially do questions, or is this too early?
No, this is perfect. Does anybody have any questions? They can type them into the chat. Or you can raise your hand. Doesn't look like there's any questions at this time.
Well, maybe
No questions at all? Come on.
Started, maybe people are typing.
I'm thinking they are typing.
Yeah, that's what I'm hoping. So I'll start it off with one question. I was very grateful, Dr. Benefield, for your presentation, just incredibly full of wisdom and education. And one question that I was thinking about in your inclusion about the constitutional amendments and understanding that these rights aren't just given, they are fought for, and they're fought for by the people. a question that I think that would be interesting for students to know about is if a group of people can't vote, how did this change come about? What did people do in order to fight for these voting rights?
People advocated. I mean, the reality is that people actually became engaged in protest demonstration. Women marched. Some of them actually got put in jail. Can you imagine that? People went to jail. People went to jail. I mean, women were actually, when the women were trying to demonstrate, especially during Woodrow Wilson was president and women were marching outside of the outside of the White House every day. And he actually had them jailed and put in mental institution and had them force fed and had that process where they think that you force feeding them, feeding them by tube, arresting them, these are things that happen. People will walk by them, spit on them, and knock them down, and felt emboldened to attack them, women, in their quest to get voting rights. So it wasn't something that somebody gave them. They actually worked hard for it. One of the things that I say often, every time I'm asked or allowed an opportunity to speak, this is what I say. Democracy is not a spectator sport where you get to sit in the bleachers and watch what's happening. It is a gladiator sport where you have to get in the arena and fight for what it is that you want. Voting rights, equality, equity, justice. You have to get into the arena and actually fight for it, quite literally. That is the only way that outside groups, have been able to advocate and struggle and fight to be included in the political process and to get some of the most arduous laws or barriers to voting and participating in the political process eliminated. That a concerted effort by very committed people have been the way in which individuals have been able to engage in the political process. And the good news is that from what I'm understanding, that a record number of young women and young men are registered to vote in the state of Texas. So apparently there's a mission focus here that people are pretty excited about the upcoming election and they want to actually vote. I was someplace doing voter registration and a young woman walked up and said, I saw somebody, she said she saw one of the candidates running for governor on TikTok. And she said, I want to register so I can vote in this upcoming election.
Great. You do have a couple of questions. Are there any volunteer opportunities for your organization?
Oh, absolutely. We're doing National Voter Registration Day next Tuesday, where we will be registering people to vote at more than 30 plus locations around Houston and Harris County. We are actually on Sunday of this Sunday, we are actually registering people to vote at the Houston Astros game. They've invited us into the arena to do that. I am right now trying to, well, not this minute, but I've reached out to the Houston Rockets and I want them to become engaged and become a partner with the League of Women Voters so that we can do a huge get out to vote rally at different strategic locations around the city of Houston and in Harris County, leading up to the early voting starting October 24th. I'm waiting to hear back from them. We had a meeting and they said they were going to see how they can harness their resources to do that. I've been reaching out to sororities and fraternities that exist in the city. Next Tuesday, we're actually going to be doing some activities. Veronica, you might be able to tell people about that. The League has been working with Houston Community College in terms of some voter registration events that's been happening. That's going to be happening in terms of next week. We're working with the University of Houston downtown. We're working with Texas Southern University. We're also working with the University of Houston main campus to actually, and Lone Star College, Tomball, Lone Star College, University Park, and some of the other Lone Star College, North Harris, working with those campuses in terms of voter registration. We always need conscientious. You can go to harrisvote.com to become a volunteer deputy voter registrar, but you don't have to be that to actually hand out cards and be part of it and recruit people, tell them to come on over to our table to register to vote, because we're going to be setting up and having these events happening. There's always an opportunity, and hopefully that we're trying to find some office space so we'll be able to have some internships in the future to have college students come and intern with us to learn about civic engagement, so about the issues too, so they can become more engaged in the political process. I'm really excited about the opportunities that will lie ahead in terms of doing that.
I recommended a movie, Iron Jawed Angels, but they asked if there are any good book recommendations.
Oh, good book recommendation about any topic or just about voting or civic engagement or political participation.
Voting history.
You know, the interesting part is the New York Times has this interesting timeline that you could go, and I had some links in there. I tend to use the links more often than actually books now, because the idea that a person is going to go procure a book to read it tend to be, they say, people don't always read the entire article now, even in the newspaper or magazine. So it's best to go with, so they could glimpse it, go through it and whatever. I would prefer, this is what I'll do, Veronica, Ashley, I will compile a list and I'll send it back to you so you can send it out to the people who participated today, who were engaged in this process. But I'm hard pressed right now to think of one single book that I could say that would encapsulate everything about voting and the history of voting. There are so many books. The Ironclad Fist is one about women in the suffrage movement. Selma is a movie about getting the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And I did have a video clip to show what happened as what we call on Bloody Sunday, but I opted not to show it because for some people, depending on the audience, that people get very, the idea of the level of violence in it can be disconcerting for some people to see the police and the state troopers beating people with billy clubs and riding over them with horses and tear gas in them. That could be pretty daunting, you know, in terms of one's psyche. But guess what? Young people have the power and the ability to do anything. They are the ones, Bob Stein over at Rice University said that the participation level from 2018 to 2020 went up by 19% among young voters. Young voters in 2008, when Barack Obama ran for president, actually spiked. And since 2016 to 2020, the 9 percentage point increase in young people voting. That it appears that young people have to have a cause, they have to believe in something very strongly. Whereas I would argue that every day of the week that you get up and you attend Houston Community College, they have a board of trustees. These individuals are elected by citizens in the respective area. These are the people who make policy for that institutional structure. You should be curious about that, because these are the people who determine what the tuition and fees are going to be, what kind of programs are going to be offered. And that has an impact, direct impact on your life. When there's a mayoral contest, the mayor gets to select the police chief, and the interaction between the police chief and the community, that impact is clearly present. When you elect judges who get to serve on the court, gets to determine sentences and get to decide whether a person is going to have probation. The district attorney's office, when that person is elected, that person gets to decide whether there is sufficient justification to seek an indictment against you or to say no harm, no foul and walk away from it. So there are decisions that are being made every day that impact your life, whether your street get paved, whether or not the water is on, whether there's a park in your community or a neighborhood, what happens in terms of the schools that exist in your community and the accessibility in terms of that school. The school board people are elected. These things that have a direct impact on everything that happens. Whereas more people are excited about voting for the president of the United States, but the president of the United States does not determine what happens in your neighborhood, what happens in your neighborhood school, what happens to your university. They are far removed from that particular process. So things that happen locally have a definitely more impact on you in your life. And so that, if nothing else, that is the incentive for you to actually go out and vote. And I want to hear all of you in the future talking about how democracy is a gladiator arena. And I'm going to be one of those people involved in that arena to bring about the change that I want to see in my community. That change can only come, it doesn't come from leadership at the top unless the input from the people at the bottom happen. And the other mantra that I always told my students when I taught at Lone Star College, I said, you can't make a withdrawal unless you made a deposit. So you have to put something in order to get something out. And this democracy is fragile. It's too important as a political system. As Stephen Breyer, the former US Supreme Court Justice, said, it's an experiment. And the question becomes whether or not you want to keep the system of government in place, and warts and all. I'm not arguing that no political system is perfect, but that is why if you look at those constitutional amendments I talked about, look at those statutory laws that I talked about, and the Supreme Court rulings that expanded voting rights that has happened in the history of this country, shows you that America as a nation state is a work in progress, and it has gotten better because of the input from the citizenry. And that is key to you, Melissa, and Naka, and King Owasu. All of us have a role to play in the political process. All of us can make a difference. And as president of the League of Women Voters, I'm trying to make an impact and make a difference by being out there, registering people to vote, and then encouraging them to get out and vote. Don't just register. You have to participate. You have to engage in the political process. In 2020, out of the 2.4 million people who were registered voters in Harris County, only 1.6 million of them actually voted. So that meant 800,000 of them did not vote in this one county. And Harris County is the largest county in the state of Texas with the greatest population. If you looked at it, they said in terms of it has the population greater than like 20 some states in geographical space in terms of large, as a kind of large, unruly kind of thing, but it's not. That we are all responsible for the democracy that we get, the government we get. As Benjamin Franklin said, we created a republic, ma'am, if you can keep it. So it becomes our responsibility to become educated about the political process and engage in the political process to ensure that we can keep it, make it better, improve upon it.
I have one last question that maybe we can end on.
Okay.
Once someone registers to vote, what tips do you suggest that we use to create a voting plan so that we actually can go out to vote successfully?
Well, you know, NBC News has a website that Plan Your Vote, but the League of Women Voters has a website. We have the Voter's Guide, which is, you could go to Vote 411 or go to the League of Women Voters.org/Voters Guide and access the Voters Guide. The Voters Guide is in English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and Chinese. So because we understand that this is a very diverse community that we live in, and we want to reach out to people. Vote 411 actually have the candidates positions on issues that they've said, and you can read basic bio information so you can make a choice. You could go to harrisvote.com, and they actually have a ballot that you could print out. You can find out, put in your address, they'll tell you who's going to be on your ballot, and you can print out that ballot. If you don't have access to a printer, I suggest that you go visit your public library. By the end of September, the League of Women Voters produced something called the Voters Guide. It's a print document with all of the candidates and their position on issue and basic bio information about them, that you could go to your Harris County Public Library or your Houston Public Library or to a community center in your community. We're also going to be distributing to some churches so that people will have access to this information so they can make informed decisions. But the digital version is online. And I think you should start there but you can't take in your phone to the polling location and use it once you've constructed your ballot. They do not allow that, but you can take the print copy of the voter's guide with the candidates that you've checked and selected. You can take that in, or a ballot that you've downloaded. You can take that into the polling location. So lwv.houston.org is the place that you can go to. Election Central, find out information. harrisvote.com is Harris County Election Administrator. If you don't live in Harris County, Fort Bend has a similar operation. If you live in some other county, they have a similar operation too, that you can go and find information. And as I said, NBC has this plan your vote. It actually has. This is one of the things at harrisvote.com, it will tell you where all the polling locations are. And in Harris County and in Fort Bend County, you can actually vote at any location during early voting. You don't have to go to the one that's near your house. You can go to one anywhere in that county and cast your ballot during the early voting period and on election day. So plan which day of the week you're going to go. Plan, review the candidates to make sure you know who you're going to vote for, and take some friends with you who are registered. But make sure everybody registers before October 11th so that they will be duly authorized to go and cast a ballot beginning October 24th, doing early voting through November 8th.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
please come and volunteer with the League of Women Voters. We'd love to have volunteers. We love to have young, enthusiastic people who want to see the political system work the way it's supposed to. The political system is only as good and can only work as great as it is if you're part of it.
Thank
And
you
Dr.
so
Benefield,
much.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate being given the opportunity to come and talk with you. I wish it could have been in person, maybe next time. How about that?
I just wanted to really quickly add, if I may, I put my email in the chat. If students have any questions that come up with voter registration or with voting, besides Dr. Benefield, you also have the Center for Civic Engagement for HCC to help you out.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for coming. And this was a wonderful presentation. We learned a lot today. Thank you for coming. I hope to have you back in the future. This is recorded. We will share it on our Student Life YouTube page if you want to see it again. And thank you for coming, everybody. And we will see you at our next events.
Thank you.
Thank you too. God bless you.
Bye-bye.